Stay up to date on the latest political news this election season for less. Visit inforum.news/port and get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Subscribe now at inforum.news/port. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Welcome to Plain Talk, and happy to be with you. I have with me two gentlemen who are central to a very interesting policy proposal that was put on the table last week. Governor Doug Burgum was obviously the sort of the headliner of the announcement, but it's a team effort, a group of state lawmakers, one of whom is on the show with me, as well as other members of the executive branch, talking about income tax reform. And essentially what they're doing is they're flattening North Dakota's income tax and as a practical matter, eliminating it for most people who are paying it today. Here to talk with me about that is North Dakota Tax Commissioner Brian Kroshus, as well as State Representative Craig Headland, who is a Republican from the Jamestown area. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Brian, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Good to be on.
Brian, let's start with you. Do you want to lay us out what does this proposal do?
The proposal is a mechanism to return some tax dollars and actually not even return them, but keep them with individuals in the state. It is broad in nature in terms of how many people it reaches. And it's essentially a flat tax of 1.5%. So it would change the current tax structure, eliminate the brackets as we know them, but it does have a twist in that it's different than other flat tax proposals that other states have, in that there's a very large deductible, if you will, and that occurred by eliminating the first tax bracket as we currently know it, that's currently in place. And of course, this would have to be passed by the legislative body in the upcoming session, but it's measurable relief. It really is a bottom-up approach. How we're looking at it in many ways, it starts with low income, no income tax. Middle income, many of those will have no income tax because an individual will not have a tax obligation on the first $55,000 they make, and a joint filing couple would not have an income tax obligation on the first $95,000, $96,000 they would make. But really the genesis of this, there are a lot of proposals out there, a lot of ways to provide tax relief, tax reform to individuals. And it's about casting the widest net. So it's not really in terms of why this instead of something else necessarily, but it's an effective mechanism to allow citizens to keep their tax dollars to begin with. So they're not even a tax dollar, but it's just money that they get to keep in their own pockets and spend as they see fit.
I currently, and the tax commissioner can correct me if I'm wrong, we have essentially 5 tax brackets under the current law, where people making anywhere from $0 up to $40,525. Well, I shouldn't say this. They pay a little over 1%, and it goes all the way up to people making more than $445,000 a year. They pay just a little bit less than 3%. And essentially, what this would do is there's 2 brackets. There's people who make, for single people who make below $54,726, they pay nothing in the income tax. And for married people who make below $95,601, there's no tax. And above that, there's just one tax bracket, 1.5%. Did I get all that right, Brian?
That is correct. Yes.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I clarified or if I confused people. I don't know. Craig, in years past, you've supported essentially eliminating the state income tax, leveraging revenues from the legacy fund and eliminating the income tax. This gets us, I want to say, most of the way there. Am I right in saying that I think about 60% of North Dakotans who pay the income tax today would pay no income tax under this plan, roughly? Is that the estimate?
That is the estimate, and you are absolutely correct. That is what I've been promoting, and I think the tax commissioner and the governor have helped us move that position forward.
Now, Craig, let me ask you this question. One concern that I really like this plan, so I'm just trying to think of potential rebuttals to this. And I know one thing that sticks in my mind a lot when we talk about income taxes, I think of how dependent our state is on commodities for our economy. And obviously those, the things we do with those commodities, whether it's energy, coal, oil, gas, whether it's agriculture, the various crops, livestock, that drives a lot of our tax revenues, both directly where we're taxing those, the production of those things, or indirectly where my income that is taxed comes from farming or comes from working in the energy industry. So I worry when we narrow the income tax like this, are we making ourselves too dependent on, for instance, oil taxes, which at times are most of where our state's revenues come from, obviously kind of depending on the oil markets. Does this make us too dependent on oil taxes?
Well, I suppose you could take it when you look at it and come up with that conclusion. But I think what we're moving forward here, those revenues are already going to be in place because of the legacy fund and the earnings that legacy fund is going to generate in the future. So as we continue to produce oil, the fund grows because of the 30% constitutional mandate that 30% of that revenue goes into the legacy fund. It grows. I can't project what it's going to be when we get there to the session, but I think the latest numbers I've seen, are we getting close? We're over 8 billion, certainly, in the legacy fund. And as that continues to grow, it's going to provide more and more revenue through earnings that are for legislative expenditures. Now, we can use those expenditures for something else, by growing government, or we can use those revenues in a way that can provide some tax relief to North Dakotans, which I think in the end will help us increase our earning potential for employees, and it'll provide growth for the state and everybody in the state. So, I think it's a win-win for everybody. And the nice thing about doing it through income tax and providing relief through income tax is it's fairly easy. It's not as complicated as doing it through property tax.
Well, all the less complicated because the income tax is a tax that the legislature levies, the state levies, as opposed to the property tax, where you have a lot of local governing entities and you have a lot of spending decisions or budget decisions that are being made locally that are driving the property tax. And then you have school boards, you have park boards, you have, counties, you have cities that are all making decisions regarding that. You're right. This is something that the state's easy to do. I think that's a well-made point. Brian, where the revenue, obviously, if we're going to take 60% of tax-paying North Dakotans and say you're not paying the income tax anymore, that's going to reduce revenues, right? So is there a plan here to replace those revenues? That comes legacy fund earnings. I think that's what Craig was referencing. Is that what we're depending on? Is revenues generated by the legacy fund's investments to replace that?
I think that's a conversation lawmakers in particular will have to have. They're the ones who decide where the funds would come from eventually. But one point I would make when it comes to income tax and the reliance, because it's a good point, it's a valid question. But at this point in time, approximately 6 to 7% of state revenue that we operate on, state revenues that fund priorities, et cetera, come from income tax. The majority comes from sales tax. We have oil and gas revenues, ag receipts, et cetera, and those related to those industries, as well as tourism and a number of other areas, business, manufacturing, et cetera. So it isn't what I would say, it doesn't cause undue exposure in terms of the state's revenue stream. And really what we're talking about is a lot of conversation. How do we get tax dollars back to citizens? And the most effective mechanism, don't collect them to begin with. leave them in the citizens' pocket. So this isn't what I would classify as an area of undue exposure. Very reasonable. It's a very small percentage. And it also is a very effective mechanism and consistent as well. You mentioned this earlier. Representative Headland has been working very hard on providing income tax tax relief overall to citizens. So this really complements his vision and what he's been working on, and I think it brings it together in a very nice way.
I agree. I mean, I think it's really interesting. One thing when this was announced, Democrats came out and they obviously had a point of view on it because this is a Republican-backed plan. Which isn't to say that Democrats couldn't support it if they want to, but it's coming from Republican leaders. One of the things that the Democrats said is that this was just another tax cut for the wealthy. Can you respond to that, Craig? When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, I that's hard to respond to because first of all, if they claim to be those that are working on behalf of working people, where's the relief going? We're going to have 60% of the bottom end earners who I think the Democrats always claim that the Republicans work for the rich. Well, then are they saying then that they're working for those that are less fortunate? But the less fortunate, the ones that have the least amount of revenue are the ones that receive the biggest benefit.
The other thing that people respond to this saying, and I agree with you, your point there. I mean, it's the bottom 60%, right? I mean, there's two tax brackets under this plan. If you make 0 to 55,000 or whatever the number is for married couples, you don't pay any tax at all. It's the people who make above that who will continue to pay the tax. And let's be clear, everybody across the board is getting some tax relief. But under this plan, the people who make the least are going to get the most. They're going to pay zero tax.
That's absolutely right. And, there is a point here. And I suppose in theory, you have to work in order to receive this relief because it comes off an income. But
yeah. So,
I think I said it on Scott Hannon's show the other day. This is relief for those that work.
Let's the other thing is I always hear people say, well, nobody's asking. I mean, people have been saying this for about as long as we've been making changes to the income tax code. They always say nobody cares about the income tax. The income tax is so low already, nobody cares about it. What everybody wants is property tax relief. That's what the legislature ought to be focusing on, not these income tax proposals. What's your response to that, Craig?
Well, I can understand why people would focus on property taxes because they are a problem. They're expensive. They've gone up and they seem to increase annually because taxable value tends to increase annually. So, yes, they are a problem. And, I don't know what percentage of people that live in North Dakota that pay taxes own property versus those that just work and pay income tax. But I suspect the benefit from buying down mills, it's going to have a substantially greater impact on somebody who owns a lot of property versus someone who doesn't, or someone who rents.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you would hope that if you reduce property tax burdens for people who own rental properties, that would filter down to the people who are renting. But I'm not sure many renters would say that that's happening. I mean, I think most of them would probably say, I'm not seeing that property tax relief. And then again, what the legislature's been trying to do is, as you said, buy down property taxes. But we need cooperation from a whole lot of governing entities, park boards, again, cities, counties, and you're counting on them to, again, pass those savings along. And I don't know that they always have, Craig.
Yeah, I'd like to make a point here.
Sure.
I think since we started in providing property tax relief or so-called property tax relief from the beginning through today, the state has spent about $7 billion. Now, if we would have done income tax relief from the beginning, that income tax could have been wiped out. It could have been gone for probably several years already, and it would be gone. And we could have still started property tax relief before that. The trouble we've had in providing additional income tax relief, we've only been able to do it in times when our surpluses are big, like they're going to be when we come back here. It's the only time we've been able to get any passed. Had we done income tax first, I believe we would have been able to get rid of our income tax burden, and we could have still started down the property tax road. But when you have the commitment to the property tax relief up front, and the fact that it grows annually because property values increase annually, it hasn't allowed us to do them both. So I think there's time that we can do additional property tax relief. But I think if we're ever going to get the real tax relief to the people that are responsible for these surpluses, I think, we need to do income tax relief up front.
Brian, I have a question about compliance, because part of the cost of income taxes is the fact that I also have to file a state income, right? When I'm doing my federal tax return, I also have to file a state income tax return. That takes me time. That takes me money, depending on, how everybody does it, maybe how complicated your filing situation is. For people who are in that new bracket where they would pay no income tax at all, are they still going to have to file a return?
They'll still have to file. If you file a federal return, you also have to file a state return. So that doesn't, that component won't go away, but the state return, I think many will go to the EZ form, which is, it takes several minutes at best to fill out. It's very straightforward, very easy. It's not complicated even with our other forms. The ND1, for example, is a common form that people use. But circling back to the property tax question, if I could, one thing when I looked at the numbers and crunched numbers, 4 out of 10, just about 4 out of 10 North Dakotans don't own a home. So they don't have property. So we're close to 40% without having any access to income or property tax relief, I should say. So 4 out of 10 wouldn't qualify under a property tax relief proposal, and 16 have been introduced, 16 bills over the past 16 years. Currently, about 17% of North Dakotans, because this will come up, they don't pay income tax currently. That number, as you mentioned, approaches close to 60%. So I think a lot of times what happens, people confuse the mechanism in terms of getting dollars back to citizens. They lose sight of the vehicle or the vision because of the vehicle. And whether it's income tax relief, whether it's property tax relief, ultimately it's about getting dollars back in the hands of citizens or leaving them there to begin with. As mentioned earlier, this proposal does it. It casts a wide net, and it's not perfect. I don't think there is a tax reform plan out there that would be perfect. All of them will have deficiencies, but I think this has very few in the whole scheme of things.
Craig, let's talk revenue again. And I asked this question previously, and I asked it to the wrong person. I asked it to the executive branch guy and not the legislative branch guy who is involved in budgeting. What is your vision for how the legislature will accommodate? Because obviously there's and listen, I want to be clear. We're kind of using some static analysis here. We don't know really what the impact on our economy is going to be, and our economy, being commodity based as it is impacted by so many other variables. It's a fraught exercise to say what the economic stimulus impact of this is going to be. I think it's going to be positive. I don't think there's any question. But obviously, I think we need to prepare for the fact that we're giving away some revenue here from the state, and that's not a bad thing. But what is your vision for how the state accommodates that within the budgets?
Well, I think we will use the current surpluses in sales tax, what income tax is generated to date, other revenues, earnings, and at the same time, we will be looking at budgets, and we will provide what's necessary to take care of the citizens in North Dakota in the human services and other budgets. We'll take care of the transportation needs. And then when all of our budgets are figured out, we'll decide whether there's revenue and into the future, whether we believe the revenue will be there that would allow us to move this proposal forward. This, we're not going to go in there and pass this on the first day. This is going to be something that is going to be decided at the end after everything else is taken care of.
Let's get back to some of the Democratic criticism of this, Craig. I'm reading when the Democratic MPL sent out a press release responding to your announcement. Your colleague, Representative Marvin Nelson, Democrat from Rolla, he said, I quote, "The Republican plan has continued to be cut taxes, especially for out-of-state corporations when it booms, then cut services and drive people out of the state when the bust comes. Despite all the talk, recruiting people to come back has been a horrible failure. This is why your community doesn't have the necessary daycare capacity. This is why rural North Dakota is left without infrastructure for business and government services. This is why mental health care continues to be ignored. This is why local governments continue to need property tax increases and special assessments. Right now, federal money is funding several state programs the administration is bragging about. No plan exists other than get your vote now and then dump the programs or fail to cut taxes." So I guess essentially his argument there boils down to, listen, Republicans are just going to cut taxes and then they're going to cut budgets, and that's going to hurt us. Respond to that, if you would.
Well, I think he probably said the very same thing back in 2015 when we reduced income taxes by 10%, or back in 2013 when we reduced them. Those are talking points. He said something that most of the relief is going to go to out-of-state businesses. That's a talking point, but it doesn't really apply here because we're dealing with individual income tax and not corporate income tax. So, the Democrats have their talking points, and I guess we have ours. And, all you have to do is look at the state. The last time the Democrats ran the state, well, it's been a real long time. Our government was a failure. They weren't providing anything to the citizens of North Dakota, and they came and all they wanted to do was take more money from people. I think that was the last time there was a proposal to raise income taxes. And as you know, it got referred. Democrats had the governor's office, and I think they had most of the statewide offices. And there may have been a majority in one of the chambers. I don't recall. But we know their policies fail, and we know our policies work. We have a 30-year record here in the state of North Dakota of economic growth. So, they can spew their talking points all the time, but I think, the proof is in the pudding and the evidence is there. Republican policies work.
Brian, earlier you mentioned that the individual income tax is about, did you say 7 to 8% of our general fund revenue picture? Can you give us a larger view of, and I'm not asking you to be, I guess, precise, but give us an idea of the pie of revenues that makes up our general fund spending. Where does it come from?
It comes from a variety of areas, as you would expect. When you look at a budget of $15 to $16 billion, for example, a state budget, and in that range, roughly a third of it is going to come from sales, retail sales, et cetera. So then you're going to have not quite a third, but close, from the oil and gas related activity, production tax, extraction tax, but also the ripple effect that those industries have in the communities that they are in proximity to, which are actually quite far reaching when you look at oil and gas related businesses, and whether it's Minot, whether it's in Bismarck, they're very prominent.
Oil workers pay a lot of sales tax. That's one example.
Right. So there are funding mechanisms that are very accessible throughout state government, if you will, and income tax is one of them, but it is certainly not what I would say it's not one of the larger players, so to speak, in terms of how we fund priorities and meet budgetary needs. So this isn't, again, going back to an earlier point, and to kind of wrap up the question you're asking, proportionately, it's a small piece of the pie. The income tax is sales tax, sales related activity, the retail sector, a number of others, oil and gas, agriculture, obviously a huge driver of the state's economy. There really isn't a business that doesn't trace back to our ag economy, especially in our middle and mid and smaller sized towns in the state. So I don't think it creates undue exposure by any stretch. And again, it goes back to how do we efficiently return dollars to citizens. So I think it's a good plan, and we will see where it goes in the upcoming session.
Craig, last question for you. When I read you that quote from Representative Nelson, he mentioned tax cuts for corporations, and I realize that's kind of a buzzword in politics. Like, oh, corporate tax cuts, right? Scary. You're supposed to do like the scary voice in a campaign ad. Corporate tax cuts. But this only deals with. First of all, I want to make it clear. This plan only deals with individuals paying the income tax. But let me ask this question: Why not corporate? Why wasn't that? What was the thought behind not including corporate tax relief as well?
Well, that's a hard one for me to answer, because initially I was working on a plan that would have worked or had incorporated some relief for corporate income tax. But the bottom line is, I think if we're going to provide the most relief in the most efficient way and get to the most people, singling and doing it on the individual income tax is the easiest, best way to do that.
And when
because a lot of corporations employ individual taxpayers, as you know, and there are a lot of large earners there. So though it may not, they've always there's always been a claim out there that corporations don't pay taxes, that they pass them on to consumers. There's a lot of people that work at corporations that pay individual income tax.
Well, and I know people don't want to hear this, but corporations are people. I realize that's a fraught term because of the Citizens United stuff or whatever, but they're just organizations of people, right? So, I mean, at the end of and they serve people. Their customers are people. Their stockholders are people. Their executives are people. It's just people. Last question: what's the timeline on this? If the legislature passes this, when would we expect to see it?
2023, right?
That'd be correct. It dovetails very nicely with House Bill 1515, which provides relief in the 2021 and 2022 tax years. This would be effective for the 2023 tax year. So it also addresses the question invariably that will come up, and that is, what is going to replace the current relief that's been issued through House Bill 1515? That was the $350 tax credit for individuals, $700 tax credit.
Kind of a pandemic era boost, I think, is what we were trying to do with that. And now the question is, what's gonna come next? And this, as you said, is the answer to that question.
Absolutely, yes.
Brian, Craig, I thank you so much for your time coming on and explaining this. It's not that complicated. In fact, it's super easy to understand. Certainly a lot easier than our current income tax code. Not that our current one's terrible, but especially not compared to the federal government. Oof. But it's an interesting proposal. I thank you both for coming on and talking about it.
Well, thank you for having us. And the point you just made, there are other states, and a lot of them. I think there's 18 or 19 different states that are lowering there. So even though today we may have the lowest rates of any state that still continues to collect tax, we're not going to be there if we don't do this proposal. Arizona has rolled out a 2.5% flat tax.
There's a lot of North Dakotans in Arizona.
There's a lot of other states that are heading that direction. So, I just think I think states are figuring out it's better to leave the people with their own money rather than it has more impact.
Gentlemen, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.